part of being successful as a startup is hard work, right? But that's not what makes or breaks you, because all of your peers are working just as hard. You can tell, I think, when someone is trying to sell you versus telling you how they really feel. Hiring a VP of product or a chief marketing officer, it's way more difficult. And part of it's just that at that level, everyone's good at selling themselves. And partly it's that you can't give someone a take-home test and come back and say, oh yeah, you know exactly how to run marketing.
You're listening to the Enterprise Ready podcast, a show aiming to change the enterprise software narrative from how to sell to enterprises to how to build for enterprises. We'll interview industry experts and enterprise software founders as we break through the jargon, establish a common vernacular, and share the lessons learned from building the world's best enterprise software. Hi, I'm Grant Miller, creator of Enterprise Ready and founder and CEO of Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications. Check us out at replicated.com. The Enterprise Ready podcast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io. In this episode of the Enterprise Ready podcast, I sit down with Jonathan Ellis, co-founder and CTO of DataStax, the primary company behind the Cassandra distributed database open source project. Jonathan and I spent a bit of time understanding his background as an engineer at various startups until he found his way into distributed storage systems at Mozy and Rackspace. Jonathan's time at Rackspace gave him the opportunity to get intimately familiar with Cassandra and even chair the Apache Foundation's Cassandra project. Eventually, Jonathan recognized the opportunity to create a commercial entity around the Cassandra project and left Rackspace to start DataStax. We discussed the evolution of the DataStax offerings that range from support and services to an enterprise offering and a recent database as a service offering. We also touch on the interplay between DataStax and the underlying orchestration platforms like Mesos and Kubernetes, even nerding out for a bit on some recent progress that his team has made with operators and self-healing automated optimization tools. Jonathan offers some insights on recruiting, interviewing, and hiring both at the exec and individual engineer level. This was a super interesting conversation, and I hope you enjoy the show. All right, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me on the show, Grant.
Great. So I'd love to just kind of jump right into it and hear a bit about your background and kind of how you got into enterprise software.
Yeah, it's actually been, I think, a bit of an atypical journey because like the first half of my career was very startup oriented. And so in the 10 years before I started DataStax, I was at 9 different companies.
Wow, that's quite a lot.
Yeah. And, it's even more when my second job, my tenure there was almost 3 years. So you pull that out, like the average gets pretty low. Some of those were because, it just wasn't a good fit. And I said, okay, I'll find something else. But more of them were, when you're doing like super early stage startups, they ran out of money. My first one was a .com bust, or another one got acquired and I was redundant. So that kind of stuff tends to happen.
So the first one was during the early 2000s, like late 90s?
Yeah, I graduated from college in December of 99.
So tell us about that. So you joined a startup right away?
I did. And it was funny. I have a friend named Gary Dusbabic, and he recruited me to this job out of college and to my next job after that. And I returned the favor. I recruited him to his next 2 jobs. It's kind of good, in industry, there's a lot of change, but it's kind of good to have those friends that you work with for multiple years, even if it's across different companies. But that first one was a little bit ahead of its time. It was trying to build a content management system on top of dynamic HTML, which, in early 2000 didn't really exist yet. We didn't have XML HTTP request yet. So the technology wasn't quite ready, and the timing was definitely bad on the, industry state.
And so were any of these, would you consider them enterprise software companies? Is that something you would have classified them at the time?
Not really. I mean, they weren't really. The closest would have been the company I worked for that built newspaper publishing software. So that had some things in common with what I think of in terms of enterprise software today, but it was more of an ISV, I think.
Okay. So you were delivering software to these newspaper organizations. That's kind of funny because it's like as the internet is disrupting everything to do with media and news, you're building software for those teams.
Yeah, so that was actually my second job. So that was like 2001 to 2003. And the writing was already on the wall. A lot of people were kind of in denial about it, but the writing was definitely on the wall in terms of this is not a growth industry.
Yeah, that's, the rising tide is quite important, right?
Yeah.
And you went to BYU, right?
I did, yes.
And so were you staying in Utah for these other jobs?
Yes. So I was in Utah for the next 10 years after graduation. And I'll skip over some jobs that kind of didn't go anywhere. But the first startup that I joined that had some success was a backup software provider called Mozy. And this kind of gets into why I'm a big fan. And I know I'm on EnterpriseReady podcast, but I'm a big fan of, as a software developer, joining startups. And what that does is the startup, if it's like most startups, it literally can't afford to hire the talent that would let it say, I'm 100% certain that Jonathan can build my storage backend because he's already done it 3 times at other companies. Like, those people are really expensive. And so Mozy was willing to take a chance and say, Jonathan, on paper, you're completely unqualified to do this, but we've interviewed you. We think you're smart, and we're going to take a chance. So it's kind of like bi-directional risk. Like, they're taking a chance on me, and I'm taking a chance on them. And that really, there's some powerful opportunities to accelerate your learning that you don't have otherwise.
Yeah.
So that actually happened with Mozy. They said, we want you to build the storage backend. So I was basically building kind of something, it's similar in spirit to Amazon S3, except it's specialized for backups, meaning we kind of don't care what the latency is to pull back a file. What we care mostly about is throughput on ingest. And then there's a footnote there that says we also care about throughput on restore, but we definitely don't care about latency on reads. So that scaled to multiple petabytes. It worked as advertised. And what happened on the way to building that, what we built was a content addressable storage system based on erasure coding. And so that's kind of, even in 2006, that was kind of pretty well understood how you build this kind of system. And the problem we ran into was we wanted to do single instance storage, meaning if you and I both upload the same MP3 or the same JPEG, this system only stores one copy, and then it says Jonathan and Grant both have copies of this file. And that takes it from just a simple content addressable store to now I need to have these relationships and track ownership of these files I'm storing. And that was a really hard problem because you couldn't just store, millions of users with billions of files and have relationships between them on any database on the market at the time. And so we kind of hacked it together using our own storage system, but it wasn't a great solution. And this kind of set off a realization in my head that, this class of problem was going to hit, basically everyone building what we called at the time Web 2.0 applications, that the database technology was just not up to the task being demanded of them.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So that was kind of where you first had the insight that the database, sort of state-of-the-art databases, weren't really going to scale and be as people were going to reach a lot of challenges with those as they sort of emerged into Web 2.0 and web scale technologies.
Exactly. Yeah. So the primary challenge, I think, was around scale, but then there's also a secondary one around availability and how do I build a database that never goes down even when there's hardware failures and even when there's a power failure in the rack or that kind of thing.
Okay, so you had that insight while you were at Mozy. And just real quick, was Mozy targeted at kind of consumer, prosumer, or was it targeted at business and enterprise to buy licenses for their employees?
I think like any good startup, the strategy changes over time, and we started targeting consumers, and there was actually a lot of interest from, hey, I like this idea. I want offsite backups for my company. Now, how do I, as an IT administrator, how do I control these accounts and quotas and so forth? And so we started moving in that direction after a year or two.
Okay, but you left there. So did the company keep going? Did you just decide to take off and do something different?
Yeah, so my timing was actually spectacularly poor. I left within 30 days of EMC making an offer to acquire them. So I left before that. But what happened was Mozy was getting to 70-ish employees, and I was reporting to a director who reported to a vice president who reported to the CEO instead of reporting directly to the CEO. And I was like, man, this is, there's too much red tape. 70-person company, man, this is huge. And so I moved on to something smaller.
Okay, so that was the reason. It was just not feeling as startup-y anymore.
Yeah, I think that's the short version. Yeah.
Cool.
And so now, skipping ahead 15 years, I started DataStax, which is 500 employees. So that's a little bit of irony for you.
Yeah. I get it though. It's like if you're going to be in a bigger company, you want to be towards the top to figure out how to have a real impact. So I get that desire. And then how did you end up at Rackspace? So that was that feels like where you really got deep on, obviously Mozy gave you some, insight into building and sort of understanding these distributed large scale storage, but Rackspace feels like it's really where the seeds of DataStax were planted. And how did you end up there?
Right. So I gave a talk at PyCon, probably 2007, where I explained the work I'd done at Mozy, because the storage backend I wrote was actually in Python, which sort of made sense in the sense that, Python is pretty slow and inefficient. But when you're talking about storing files, you care a lot more about disk I/O than you care about CPU efficiency. So it sort of made sense. It turns out like there's actually a bunch of reasons why Python wasn't ready for that kind of system software, which turned into another talk I gave called What Python Can Learn from Java. I've got pretty strong opinions about this. But the people at Rackspace saw the talk that I gave about the storage system I built, and they said, oh, that looks really interesting, because we're building out cloud services. We want to compete with Amazon. And again, Rackspace's strategy has changed since then, but at the time they wanted to compete head-to-head with Amazon and have, a file storage system and, DNS as a service and all these things. And so they said, hey, you should come and work with us. And I said, I'd be interested, but what I'm more interested in than recreating this storage service is the next step of scalable databases. I think that's the big unsolved problem. And they said, you're right. We definitely need that at Rackspace for our customers, for our own internal services. So we'll hire you to work on that. And so that was in the fall of 2008. And that summer, Facebook had open sourced Cassandra. So it wasn't Apache Cassandra yet. It was it was Cassandra from Facebook. And so I got to evaluate, when I got to Rackspace, I got to evaluate Cassandra. There were some systems you don't hear about anymore, but were, recently open sourced at the time. There was Voldemort from LinkedIn. There was Dynamite from PowerSet. There was MongoDB. There was HBase. So I got to evaluate these systems and say, I think that this space is super early. All of these technologies are super young. So rather than optimize for who's got the most complete solution right now, like that's going to change in the next 12 months. What I'm going to optimize for is who's got the best foundation. And I really thought that Cassandra's combination of a fully peer-to-peer scale-out solution combined with a big table style data model that gives you rows and columns was the best foundation to start with. So that's kind of what I put my energy into.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so you took a sort of broad evaluation of all the various technologies that were emerging to sort of solve this distributed database problem. Were they calling it big data at that point? Was that a term?
My memory's fuzzy, but I think they were.
Okay, so like, kind of this big data problem. And you like just kind of fell in love with Cassandra, or what happened there?
Yeah, it was really the technical factors that caused my man crush, I guess. And I would add a third factor, which is that it was remarkably simple for what it did. I think at the time it was under 50,000 lines of code compared to, for instance, HBase was clocking in at around 250,000. And so I'm looking at that and saying, if these two are doing roughly the same thing and one of them is 5 times as complex, I think I can move the needle a lot faster on the simpler one.
Okay. And so you took some type of involvement with getting Cassandra involved with Apache, or what happened? How did that come about? How did it become, Apache Cassandra?
Yeah, so there was me and there was one other guy, I think from, I don't remember what company he was at the time. He eventually joined Cloudera. His name's Todd Lipcon, really talented engineer. And we were both maintaining, our own kind of forks of Facebook's Cassandra. And so the engineers at Facebook, they were kind of taking an attitude of, if this is useful for you, then great. But we're not looking to build a community. We're looking to solve problems we have at Facebook. Mm-hmm. If our work turns out to be useful to other people, then great. But we're optimizing for our own problems. Kind of their nod towards this nascent Cassandra community was to contribute the code to Apache. And I became the first non-Apache committer to Cassandra, or non-Facebook committer to Apache Cassandra.
Okay, cool. And did they continue to use the upstream Apache version, or did they maintain like their own fork?
So this is actually where I get to tell my story about the time I broke Facebook. They were running, not only were they running Apache Cassandra, but for the first few weeks they were running from trunk. We were using Subversion, so they were pulling from trunk and building that and just pushing it into production. And so after I became committer, I'm like, cool, I'm going to commit stuff. And I started committing some of the patches that I'd put together. And one of them broke something catastrophically. And Avinash was instant messaging me. I think it was on a late Friday night, like, what did you do? Everything's broken.
That's amazing. Well, you were moving fast. So
yeah.
It's acceptable.
Yeah, so we had a discussion about like branches and stable branches and that kind of thing.
And Avinash was one of the creators of Cassandra at Facebook, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Got it. Okay, so you were at Rackspace, really excited about Cassandra. I'm guessing that did Rackspace have a Cassandra as a service offering, or what was going on there?
Yeah, so the first thing we were targeting at Rackspace was similar to what we'd done at Mozy, where they had this file storage system and they wanted to track which users owned which files. Before we got Cassandra to a stable enough point where that rolled out, they actually started over with a completely different architecture for their cloud file storage, and I'd left to start DataStax. So it ended up not ever going into production at Rackspace at the time. Several years later, Rackspace became a DataStax customer, but that was kind of a different era at that point.
All right, cool. So tell us more about. So you're on this Apache Software Foundation. You helped kind of get that going. You're the first committer into Cassandra outside of Facebook. And what makes you decide wow, there's a big opportunity here. I should start a business around this?
So I'm going to caveat this with, my crystal ball wasn't perfect. So if I did it over again, I would have started DataStax much faster than I actually did. What I actually did was, it was about a year and a half into working on Cassandra before I left to start DataStax. And that was time that it set DataStax back versus where we could have been, just because, when I went and got my Series A of funding, I staffed up to, 8 engineers working on Cassandra relatively quickly. And the most Rackspace had ever had on Cassandra was 4. So, right away you're saying, I could have gotten twice as much done for that time that I was at Rackspace versus at DataStax. So I didn't do it quickly enough in hindsight. But what actually pushed me over into starting the company, even though it was kind of outside my comfort zone, was kind of a sense of pride in what I was building. And we had a telecom company that was active on the Cassandra mailing list in late 2009. And I was really excited about this because, this was Cassandra like 0.5 or maybe 0.6. So it's super early still, but this is a really great use case that the company has. And then all of a sudden, I didn't hear anything more from them from several weeks. And I reached out and asked what happened. And they said, well, my boss said we needed to go use Riak from Basho because we can get a commercial support contract, even though Cassandra is better technology for what we're doing. And I was like, man, that really sucks. Somebody needs to start a company around Cassandra so that we can solve that bug, if you will.
That's funny. Someone should do that.
Right.
So you'd been, early engineer at a lot of different companies. What gave you the sort of confidence or, desire to be like, well, I'm going to go start that company?
I think a couple of things did. One is that the man who became our lead investor for our Series A, John Vrionis, had actually talked to me about 6 months earlier. So this was right around the time where you had big data, but then you also had NoSQL. And one of my coworkers at Rackspace, Eric Evans, created the NoSQL term, something which he has mixed feelings about to this day. Mm-hmm. So that was the touch point, I think, for some broader awareness that, oh yeah, this scalable database thing, this is a problem that needs to be solved. And John was one of the earliest investors to start looking at that. Somehow he tracked down my contact information and called me up. We had a conversation about it. And I believe he asked me specifically, so when are you going to start a company for Cassandra? And I said, I'm not ready to do that yet.
And was he at a venture fund or was he an angel?
Yeah, he was a venture capitalist from Lightspeed.
Okay, cool. So he's researching the industry, sees this project, sees that you're a contributor, you're not at Facebook, thinks that you might be the best person to actually go off, and you're probably the chair, you're the chairman of the foundation or something, so thinks you're the best person to start this company.
Right. I was the chairman of the Apache Cassandra project, which is distinct from the board of directors of the 200-odd projects at the Apache Software Foundation.
Right. But so you're chairing that specific project. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's great. So you have inbound investor interest from a reputable venture fund. So that's helpful in terms of giving you some confidence that you might be able to start a company around this.
Exactly.
And then you decide to stop and you maybe talk to someone else is working on it with you and bring them on as a co-founder. How did that happen?
So I was leading the Cassandra technology effort, and there was another team led by a guy named Matt Feil that was more like, we're going to deploy Cassandra for these different projects. So he was going to be running the Cassandra service. So when I told Rackspace management that I was going to leave to start a company, Matt drove down. He was in Austin. I was in San Antonio. Matt drove down to talk me out of it. And it ended up working the other way around, where he decided to join me as our first CEO.
Okay, very cool. And is he someone you had worked closely with while at Rackspace?
That's right, yeah. Since we were kind of working on the two halves of the Cassandra service, yes.
That makes total sense. Okay. And did you raise right away? Is that when you sort of went straight back to Lightspeed, or?
Yes, effectively right away. And so we ended up raising a $2.5 million Series A, which in another one of those hindsight moments was not enough to do an infrastructure company, but that's what we did.
Yeah, and now we would call that a seed to pre-seed, right? That's just the way.
That's right. Yeah, it's a different world.
Yeah, it totally is. And then you moved to Austin to start the company, or did you stay in San Antonio?
I stayed in San Antonio at first, and before we started recording, I mentioned that hiring executives is one of the things that looks easy until you try it. Our first VP of engineering was kind of a disaster. And so most of our engineers were in Austin at first. And so I actually moved to Austin to do damage control.
Okay, great. So, and that's where your CEO was. That's where most of the team ended up being, or did you end up hiring pretty distributed?
Yeah. So for the first year, we did have a concentration in Austin. And then our investors convinced us that we needed to have our headquarters in California. So Matt moved out to stand up that new office there. But on the engineering side, we did have kind of a cluster in Austin and later on a cluster in California. But one of the things that I wanted to preserve from my time working on open source first was that distributed engineering and that sense that we can hire the best people no matter where they are, and location shouldn't be an obstacle, to writing code collaboratively.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of the, core open source ethos, right? Is that you can kind of do this from anywhere.
Yeah, and what that gives you is you do need to be able to work in a more asynchronous fashion because, instead of going over to the next cube and saying, hey, Gary, can you review this patch that I just wrote? And then going over it with him, it's more of I'm going to do a pull request and Gary will review it when it's convenient for him, which might be, in a time zone 6 or 12 hours away. And so I need to be able to task switch and work on something else in the meantime. So that's a little bit difficult for some people, but I think most engineers deal with that pretty well. But in exchange for that, you get a lot of benefits. And this is something that I'm pretty passionate about, that as a manager in a traditional office environment, even if you're trying super hard to be objective, you can't help but be influenced by things like Jonathan is the first one in the office and the last one to leave. He sure works hard. And, when my team is completely distributed, then I'm forced to manage by, is Jonathan actually doing good work? And is he, doing it effectively? So I think it's a lot healthier and it's a lot more, it's kind of the world that engineers want to live in, which is good work gets rewarded and bad work doesn't. And, politics doesn't play a role. There's still politics, but I think it is less of a factor in a distributed culture.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's become, obviously a pretty big trend in the last 10 years. You started in Austin and opened up a headquarters in SF or in California. And I think you've seen the same trend happen. A lot of people are based in SF or the Valley and are opening, technical offices either in Austin or throughout the rest of the world in order to have access to more engineers, more distributed team, without paying the huge tax on talent up in the Bay Area. So,
and it's not just access to more engineers, but it's also access to more senior engineers. And the reason why I believe that is, if you're in the Valley, as a 20-something single person, the cost of living is super high, but the salaries are also super high. You can make that work. But when you start looking at, hey, I've got a serious relationship, we're starting to think about having kids, that's kind of a different era of life. And it's a lot harder to do that in Silicon Valley unless, you've IPO'd or something and you're calling in rich. So we've had some of our early engineers who we hired in the Valley, because I mentioned we do have some engineers at our headquarters, and some of those have moved to Louisiana or to Texas, and that's fine, right? That's not an obstacle for us versus other companies that might be oh, you need to find a new job. So I think that not just being flexible about the place, but having that asynchronous decoupling of office hours from when you do the work, I think that's really healthy because it gives you a chance to get a bit of that work-life balance, where the trend has always been work has been bleeding more and more into your personal life. But when you're working from home, it's okay for your personal life to bleed a little bit into work. I go pick up my kids, but that's okay because I'm going to be writing code, after she goes to sleep.
Yeah, it does definitely require a level of separation still, right? You sort of have to be, sort of either doing one thing completely or another thing completely. So picking up your kids, you're not trying to also write code, right? And there's a there's a level of sort of maturity and focus that's required in order to be successful as a remote sort of distributed team. And I think it probably is better for more senior folks anyway, because they kind of understand how work actually gets done.
I think that's a good word to use, the maturity word. I was talking with our director of culture. I'm not sure if that's his formal title, but that's kind of what he's doing. And he's kind of new to the distributed engineering thing. And he said, so basically what you're saying is it's like attending a college class where the teacher says, I'm not going to take attendance, but I will grade you on your final. And so like it's, some students can deal with that, and other students are like, oh, he's not taking attendance, I'm not going to show up, and then I fail.
Yeah. It's definitely an important skill, I think, in this sort of modern, enterprise software, just software world, to be able to hire, recruit, and help onboard those folks into that kind of remote environment. Cool. So let's talk a bit more about sort of DataStax in the early days, right? So, you sort of start this company, you get $2.5 million funding, you hire on 8 engineers, and did you sort of were you modeling the company and the go-to-market after other database, like open core vendors like Mongo and these others that you kind of mentioned, or Basho and React? Like what were the sort of go-to-market motions that you were emulating?
I think our peers were kind of figuring this out at the same time as we were. So we weren't really looking to each other as, we're going to imitate what DataStax does or what Basho does, so much as like the generation of infrastructure software just previous. So JBoss was one of the ones that we looked at, and we said, oh, like this open core model seems to work pretty well for JBoss.
Yeah, and I guess you sort of didn't have a choice about it being open core, right? Because your team didn't create the underlying technology that was happened at Facebook. They open sourced it, and so you were open core. Like that wasn't a choice, right?
That's right. Yeah, and it turned out that I guess a lot of people came to similar conclusions that open core was probably the best way to build a company around open source, because even our peers, like we mentioned MongoDB, they own their copyright. It doesn't belong to Apache Software Foundation. So they could have done lots of different models, but they followed a pretty similar open core strategy.
And when did you actually start working with customers? Like right away, or so like this telco, did you get a contract with them right away, or did it take a while to start to get some amount of paying customers?
It was pretty quick. So we started the company, I believe, officially in beginning of May. And we announced our A round, I think, in July. So, in just those few months, we already had customers before signing that A round. So I remember a couple of them don't exist anymore, because, that's kind of the nature of the technology space. But yeah, we did have some customers by then.
And were those customer relationships purely sort of like the support and training?
Okay. Yeah, support and services. And the plan was, hey, like we said, open core, we're going to build stuff around this. We're going to sell a product. But like those super early customers, they're just straight up paying us for support.
Great. And when did you offer the first sort of enterprise product?
Man, I'm struggling with my internal Wayback Machine here, but I think that was probably 2012.
Okay. And how did you differentiate that product? What was in that wasn't in the open core project?
So the first thing we added was Hadoop integration. So that was like the hot big data thing at the time. And then we added search through basically a fork of Solr that we hacked up to run on top of Cassandra. And then we started doing things around security.
And what were the security things?
So the audit logging is one, support for physical security modules, encryption at rest. So I think what kind of the standard things you'd expect, I think.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. And so encryption at rest wasn't like a default feature. I'm guessing maybe it is now.
It's a little bit messy because Apache Cassandra in the open source project provides support for encrypting what's called your SS tables, but not for encrypting other things like the commit log or the index files. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And so we said, we're going to solve that end to end and plug all the holes.
Okay, interesting. Have you released some of the proprietary features around Cassandra back into the open source over time as they've become sort of more like common in other contemporary databases and alternatives?
We haven't done a whole lot of that. What's more common is we'll look at something that we're working on, and sometimes this overlaps with things that other contributors are working on in the Apache world. For instance, the upcoming Cassandra 4.0 includes an implementation of system views where we present internal data about the system as views that you can select from with the Cassandra query language instead of having to go over the Java management API that's Java only. So we were working on that concurrently, and we said, okay, let's join forces and combine these efforts.
Okay, so occasionally there'll be things that you have roadmapped as potentially enterprise offering, but then the community maybe wants to pull into the open core, and you'll collaborate on building that together.
Right.
Cool. And then make it an open core feature, sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
And as you've, sort of scaled out DataStax, it seems like the majority of your business has been sort of the enterprise offering. And are you taking a top-down approach to that where you have enterprise sales reps who are going out into the world and engaging with folks who have used Cassandra? Are they approaching folks that have never heard of Cassandra? How do you sort of approach that go-to-market side?
Yeah, when we introduced DataStax Enterprise, we pulled the plug on selling open source support contracts, and we said, we're not a support company, we're a product company, and we sell DataStax Enterprise. And this is for solid reasons that you can probably guess at, that we wanted to be seen by the market as a product company and have the margins associated with that. But at the same time, we did lose something from that, in the sense that there are people out there who want support for Apache Cassandra but don't necessarily want the enterprise features that we're selling. And so late last year, we added what we call DataStax Luna, which is a support offering for Apache Cassandra. And so I guess that's kind of a sign of the maturity of the company, that we're comfortable that we've defined ourselves as that product company, and we can go ahead and sell support for Cassandra as well without diluting that a great deal.
Okay, interesting.
And then you asked about the go-to-market, and yeah, it's pretty much enterprise sales manager, GTM, where we are primarily targeting Cassandra users, but also we have a fair sprinkling of customers who have gone straight from Oracle or even mainframes to DataStax without first, stopping with Cassandra. So they're primarily the Cassandra market, but also people who have, scale out problems in general.
Okay. And so that's more of a true top-down sale where, you're coming in and replacing existing technologies without them sort of coming up and showing interest in the open source community.
Right.
Cool. It sounds like you also recently created a hosted version of this. I think you call it Apollo.
Yes.
Is that targeted at the same type of user, or is that a little bit more mid-market oriented? Who's the targeted user for that? And tell us more about that product as well.
What we're trying to do with Apollo is really expand the Cassandra market. I think Cassandra has a reputation, justifiably, as extremely powerful. It can solve problems nobody else can, but it's also difficult to manage and to run. And so our pitch with Apollo is, we're going to deliver the power of Cassandra, but now it's just a couple clicks to get up and running, and you never have to manage it. It's a database as a service. And so I think that Cassandra has been held back a little bit by the technical requirements and the knowledge of the team to run it. And that's the problem we're trying to solve with Apollo.
Okay, great. And when did you launch Apollo?
We started our open beta in October.
Okay, so it's quite recent.
Yes.
And is it the same features and tooling as DataStax Enterprise, or is it kind of a lighter version of that?
It is a lighter version. It's a Cassandra-shaped version. So we're providing Cassandra features, but we're not providing the search features or the analytic features from DataStax Enterprise. We are bringing in some of those security features to Apollo. I think that's kind of the right place to start in terms of what are the enterprise features that are most well suited for a let's grow the Cassandra market audience.
Okay, great. And this fits really into that same sort of idea of we kind of call it product assortment, right? Good, better, best. And so, now there's the open source edition, there's the Apollo version that gives you the hosted version plus like a handful of other security features, and then there's the super enterprise edition that you can run in your own environment. It has, additional enterprise tooling and reporting and analytics. Is that right?
Right. And the plan is to merge the Apollo and the DSE feature sets over time. But that's a good description of where we're starting.
Cool. Just any new product is so hard to do. And it sounds like the go-to-market effort here and making this, is it a self-serve kind of sign up and get going workflow?
It is, yes. And we offer a permanent free tier for people to use. And you get X amount of resources, and that's free. It's not a free for 30 days. It's just free.
Oh, cool. And so targeting there like developers and trying to get more adoption of Cassandra more broadly, it sounds like.
Yes.
So part marketing, part funnel, part build a business around this as a service product over time.
Exactly. And it's also about improving the user experience, because when you're controlling the platform, you can do things like, we've integrated what we call DataStax Studio, which is a notebook interface to Cassandra, and that lets you, start exploring your data and adding new data. Like it's part of the web interface of Apollo itself, and not something separate that you have to download and configure.
Mm. And so, are you still targeting sort of developers, or does this start to go into more like maybe a data scientist might use this to put data in?
I did blur that line a little bit when I started talking about Studio, but we are targeting developers primarily at this point.
Okay. But Studio kind of gives this like UI experience maybe for someone else at the company that developer might work with over time, and to give them an experience to explore the data.
Yes.
Oh, cool. That's really interesting. And so will you have a separate go-to-market and sales team around the Apollo offering, or sort of a lot? Will your enterprise reps still sell the same thing?
I don't think this is a case where there's a right answer and a wrong answer, but the answer we're going with right now is that we want our enterprise reps to focus on DSE, and Apollo will be a new motion with a different set of people.
Cool. That makes tons of sense. Okay, and it's interesting because within the DataStax world, obviously Cassandra and a lot of your contemporaries, like we're solving really interested distributed data and distributed storage and compute problems before the world of Kubernetes came around, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so now when you sort of look at the ecosystem, obviously like distributed systems have become incredibly like popular, and it's become this huge wave. And I think Kubernetes at the helm has really driven a lot of that. And I know you have some Kubernetes offerings and you're moving more into that world, but I'd love to sort of hear your perspective on one, sort of the emergence of Kubernetes and how that's changed your business and how that's changed some of your offering and go-to-market as well.
Okay. I think the most important thing about Kubernetes is that it has become an industry standard for orchestration of container-based infrastructure. And so, like, if it hadn't been Kubernetes, if it had been Mesosphere, for instance, I would have been okay with that outcome. But it turns out that Kubernetes basically won, and that's the world we live in. So the database space is a little bit later than other infrastructure to move to Kubernetes, because Kubernetes has struggled with managing stateful applications for a while. Recently, I would say in the last year, maybe if you're more optimistic, you'd say last 2 years, it's turned the corner, and it's a lot more ready to deal with stateful infrastructure now. But we're there now. So Apollo is built on top of Kubernetes. We're providing an operator for DataStax Enterprise that's built on the Apollo one as well. So yeah, I think it's the industry standard.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I was wondering if Apollo would be running on top of Kubernetes. So it is. That's interesting. And you mentioned your operator, right? So for those who aren't as familiar with the Kubernetes ecosystem, very popular sort of concepts, particularly around the stateful services, is this idea of operators. And so there's a couple different frameworks. One from Google, I think they call KubeBuilder. One from Red Hat, they call the operator framework. I'd love to hear your perspective on this, but generally the way that I understand it's pitched is it's sort of some of the same operational knowledge that you might use to create a service like Apollo. You start to bake some of that into a scheduler aware and sort of smart manager that sits inside of the cluster and then is managing the different instances of the service, right? And so is that sort of how you think about it as well?
Yeah. So some of the things that you'd want an operator to take care of in a Cassandra world are, I want to add capacity. I want to add, another node to my cluster, or I want to upgrade my cluster to a new version. But I want to do that intelligently, where first I upgrade one node, and when that's done, I upgrade another. So there's this kind of rolling upgrade rather than a big bang where we shut it down and restart it. So basically, the idea is that you do automate and build in like error handling. What happens if I start adding a node to my cluster, but then like the network connection dies? What do I do at that point? Build those things into the operator instead of hoping that everyone does it correctly in kind of an ad hoc on their own fashion.
Yeah, and you're actually using that same operator that I think. Did you open source the operator?
It's not open source, no.
Okay, but you have this operator. You do offer it as part of DataStax Enterprise, then?
Yes.
Okay, so you offer it as part of DataStax Enterprise, and you're also using it as a foundational piece of operating the Apollo service.
That's right.
Great, and. So, one thing I'm always curious, and this is maybe going to get really nerdy and technical for the Kubernetes world here, but when I think about the opportunity for operators, and you describe some of the sort of common tasks that it might perform, one thing that you didn't mention was around sort of performance, right? So is this an area that you think that operators can start to have a hand in, where maybe they're integrated with Prometheus or something else, and you're getting some amount of feedback from how the system is performing, and then you're making automated tweaks based on that? Or is that just too far out?
I think we're really close to that world. The research group at CMU under Andy Pavlo has built a machine learning based database tuning and optimization service, and it's called OtterTune, so like the animal OtterTune. And what it does is, it says, hey, there's 125 configuration knobs for Cassandra, and there's over 500 for MySQL. That's more than even the best human can reasonably deal with. So as a human, I come in and I say, I'm going to make this Cassandra workload perform better. I'm going to go to like the half a dozen most important tunables. And that's probably where I stop, because there just isn't time to deal with more. But when you have an automated system, it's got all the time in the world, and it can start going down that long tail of maybe this setting that's a little more obscure is actually going to move the needle for you. So I think we get to a point where it's not just saving humans time, but it's doing better than humans can actually do. And where Kubernetes comes in is, I think that the way it makes the most sense is for the optimization service to run above Kubernetes and to push out its recommendations through the Kubernetes operator rather than building it into the operator itself. But that's kind of a level of detail that, again, there's more than one right answer. But I think we're really close to where that becomes not just a research project, but ubiquitous in the industry.
I love that. I've actually been following AutoTune for a while as well, and I agree. It's super fascinating. I think some of the talks that Andy gives, he kind of compares the idea of like who can configure a Postgres database the best, right? AutoTune, RDS, or like the best Facebook DBA.
Yes.
And it was like basically AutoTune is better than RDS, but like the Facebook DBA, made some tweak that was a business level decision about a knob that you would tweak that only if you knew the system that was happening would you get that advantage. Mm-hmm. But generally, the idea is that you can, because there are so many knobs and so many things, that this system can sort of intelligently test them out until it's created the most performant solution.
Yes.
I'm actually like, this is such a nerdy thrill, but like I haven't talked to many people about AutoTune, and they did another project before that, Peloton, not to be confused with the bikes, but this is a really interesting and emerging area of technology where I think if we can get to true self-healing and self-optimizing services, it creates this sort of really amazing future for how we can run and operate services at scale without, needing so much hand-holding in observation. So I'm really excited about that future.
Yeah. So, occasionally I have people ask me, so, isn't database a commodity now? Like, does it even matter if you're running Cassandra or MongoDB or MySQL versus PostgreSQL? And I think when you look at, things like this, like there's a lot of scope for improvement still, and that's going to be really material to people. So, yeah, I don't think we've tapped out the innovation in the database space or the more broad infrastructure space at all.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's so much opportunity. I believe that we have made leaps and bounds in terms of what we've been able to do with creating these patterns and primitives for distributed systems in the last 15, 10, 5 years. But the opportunity to continue to make bigger and bigger improvements, I think is still directly in front of us.
Exactly.
It's interesting, you mentioned Mesos and sort of this idea that like, hey, obviously Kubernetes is one, and I guess like Mesos, being part of the Apache Foundation, like you probably had a deeper integration with it first. I think Mesos is also sort of like generally like thought of as having a better like integration with stateful services, 5 years ago rather than the last 2 years. You mentioned Kubernetes, mm-hmm. And so is that an ecosystem that you were fairly invested in at some point at DataStax as well?
Now that you mention it, yeah, we were pretty early partners with Mesosphere, and like you said, they dealt with databases and stateful services at a time when Kubernetes didn't. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting alternate reality to picture where Mesos won, but here we are.
Do you have any? I mean, I don't put you on the spot. Do you have any thoughts around like why you think that Kubernetes actually ended up winning?
I think it's a couple things. One is, it did come out with the weight of Google behind it. I think at a technical level, it's that, Kubernetes was really built for the container world, whereas Mesos started I'm thinking in terms of VMs. And so there was some baggage that they had that Kubernetes didn't. But I don't think either of those are necessarily things that couldn't have been overcome, again, in some kind of alternate reality.
The community nature of Kubernetes, I think, has been pretty impactful, right? You saw Red Hat and Google and Microsoft all get on pretty early. I think that and then it just was more open, maybe. It just felt like there wasn't a single leader because Google, they were been involved, but they weren't dominating the commercial offering space. So
could be.
Cool. And then, another topic, I look over at DataStax and sort of particularly the leadership team that you've managed to pull together and recruit over the last few years. And, there's this guy I've mentioned on the podcast before that just joined as your chief product officer, Ed Enough, who I have a ton of respect for as an incredible product leader. But I also know you recruited over Sam Ramji, who was at Cloud Foundry and Google for a while, and Chet is your CEO. So, when you think about scaling an organization and bringing on these sort of executive hires who have done all of this before. You mentioned like it's hard to get those when you're smaller, but once you start to scale, like how do you think about finding, recruiting, and engaging, such great executive talent like that in the way that you've done in the last few years?
Yeah, I think this is a hard problem that I'm not very good at. And it's primarily the job of the CEO, right? Like it's the job of the CEO to hire the executive team. And, I'm involved in the process. But, when I'm looking at hiring engineers, I can do a technical interview and, we can go into what effective technical interviewing means. But I can say with nearly 100% certainty, like this engineer can do the job. And then you still have some false positives where like Jonathan can do the job, but he's actually really bad at dealing, having that maturity to work in a distributed environment. And so there's still, some hires that aren't going to work out, but in terms of can he do the job, I have a very clear signal on that. And when it comes to hiring a VP of product or a chief marketing officer, like it's way more difficult. And part of it's just that at that level, everyone's good at selling themselves. And partly it's that you can't give someone a take-home test and come back and say, oh yeah, you know exactly how to run marketing for DataStax. So I'm really impressed with the job Chet's done recruiting quality talent. And, I think if he has a secret weapon, I think what it is that Chet is not selling something, right? In the sense that when Chet recruits an executive, he says, here's why I think DataStax is going to change the world. And he's completely honest about that. And you can tell, I think, when someone is trying to sell you versus, telling you how they really feel. So I think that his sense of mission and his excitement is contagious.
That's interesting. Okay. But I mean, you kind of helped bring Chet on board in some way, right? It's like even just getting him to be engaged. He's been quite successful throughout his career. He built and sold Apogee to Google. So did you have to do the same thing where you kind of just shared your vision for why DataStax was so important in order to kind of get him engaged?
Yeah, and I wouldn't have articulated it that way, but now that you say that, I think that's exactly what happened. Part of being successful as a startup is hard work, right? But that's not what makes or breaks you because all of your peers are working just as hard. So sometimes you just have to roll the dice and hope that it lands on, sixes. And with our CEO hires, first with Billy Bosworth and then with Chet, I think that's the kind of success that you can't really plan for and you can't get just by working hard. Like the stars have to align and you have to get a bit lucky. And I think that's what happened.
Yeah. But I mean, it takes building something interesting in a compelling space and then also, have a team that they're excited to work with. And it's one of these things that I'm thinking about more and more as I want to build out an exec team. And, I'm trying to figure out like, how do I, one, find the folks that really kind of already believe some of the core things that we believe? And then two, like, are willing to take a risk, on an earlier stage company because they see the opportunity to really scale. So it's just one of these interesting challenges I think you have to do, as you build a big company, but something that most of us don't have much experience with, right? Like, yeah. I'm sure you had never recruited many, senior executives to teams that you were at before. So
yeah, hopefully, and this is where investors are actually really useful. So when I was starting DataStax, all the investors were like, "Oh, we will be your partner and not just write you a check." And I'm like rolling my eyes and thinking, yeah, that's great, but what I really want is the check. But it's actually true that the non-financial contributions can actually be really meaningful. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed about working with John Vrianis is how he has been so involved at every stage of DataStax. And I don't want to spend too much time praising my investors, but stereotypically you've kind of got early stage and late stage investors, and maybe somewhere in there you've got mid stage specialists. But John's been able to scale with us from that early stage to where we are today, and be meaningfully involved all along the way. So hopefully your investors will be able to make introductions to the kinds of executives that you're looking to recruit.
And he's been on the board since that first $2.5 million round?
Yes.
Wow. How big is the board right now? Like how many folks have like not just observer, but true board seats?
I want to say 7. I'd have to go through the names in my head, but I think it's 7.
Sure. And you're one of those, I assume?
I am, yes.
Yeah, boards are interesting as companies get larger and larger.
That's right.
Cool. And then one thing you said, which I would love to just get your perspective on, is you said, something about technical hiring and sort of that interview process. And it sounds like you have a bit of a framework that you use. I'd love to hear that, because I think that's often a challenge, early on is having a really clear idea of what, a developer can come in and accomplish and fit well with your culture. I'd love how you think about that.
Yeah. So there's a dial you can adjust in terms of, how many false positives do I get versus how many false negatives, in the sense that, if my hiring process is super rigorous, then I'll be very confident that I'm not hiring someone incompetent. On the other hand, a lot of, senior talent will look at that and say, man, I'm not spending 4 hours on a technical interview when I can go get a job, with a conversation at other places. So there's a bit of a dial there. And when I was running our Cassandra team, so up until fall of 2015, I had the dial pegged really hard towards I will not have any false positives. And one of the tools that I used for that was actually taking advantage of the open source nature of Cassandra to actually give people, here's a ticket that someone has filed against Cassandra that represents either a legitimate bug or a legitimate feature we want to add. And the tricky part is, finding something that's meaningful enough that people can sink their teeth into a little bit, but not so meaningful that it's critical that we solve this for customers right away. But we did a reasonable job of threading that needle. And so, like, the state of the art of technical interviewing is you want to give the interview as much connection as possible to what someone will actually be doing on the job. So, like, at the far end of completely useless is asking someone to write quicksort on a whiteboard. Like, nobody writes code on whiteboards. They have Google, they have Stack Overflow, they have IntelliJ to do code completion. Like, you want it to be as real as possible. And then if you say, here's an actual ticket from the open source project, that's not going to just require you to write code, but also to understand existing code, which I think is actually harder when you have a meaningful existing code base, then that's as realistic as you can get.
Yeah, that's great. We've been doing similar things. I think being open source is really helpful there, because the sort of the ask of, hey, contribute to this open source project is much different than like, hey, like, write this. Like, we're going to give you access to some repo, or we've created some fake example, spend 8 hours doing this project. Committing to open source is something that folks are interested in. And then one thing that we do that I think is partially just because like the industry seems to be, there's a little bit of blowback around asking folks to do too much during an interview process, is we like to just give some amount of recognition for that contribution. So could be like a $250 Amazon gift card or something.
Yeah, we ran into that a little bit, where people are like, oh, you're trying to get me to provide free labor during the interview process. And that wasn't the idea. We'd have like a dozen candidates working on the same ticket. Basically, we'd use the same ticket until somebody from the community went and fixed our ticket and committed it, and then we couldn't use it anymore.
I love that idea around it, and I think it's good. It's right. It's like, I mean, I actually, my thought is like, better to actually not get free work, but not have people do work that doesn't matter. And so there's this interesting mix. It's like, and that's why we sort of say like, hey, we're going to recognize your contribution with a gift card, because, I don't want to like spend the time to pay people and put them on some type of contractor thing. But if we can say, hey, here's a gift card for this effort, we don't expect free labor. So
right.
It's an interesting debate within the ecosystem. We like our little solution, but the main challenge, to your point, is like, it's actually quite hard to find like the right level of issue or, to give to someone to do. You're like, oh, is that one too complicated? Is that too easy? So, you kind of would want to reuse the same thing over and over. But one other thing you said that I'm interested to see how you think about it. Like you said, Chet, and you would have to do it at the same time when you were recruiting executives particularly, but explain why it's going to have such an impact on the world. When you think about DataStax, I'd love to just hear you kind of talk for a bit about why this is such an important company in technology, and how do you sort of sell that that larger vision? Like what is that for DataStax?
Yeah, so when we were initially raising money, the reaction we got from a shocking number of investors was, this is cool technology, but there's a market for 5 companies in the world that need a scalable database more than they can get from Oracle. And I think in the 10 years since then, we've been thoroughly vindicated by the market that this actually is something that virtually all modern applications need to think about. If I'm successful, I'm not going to fit on my my SQL box or my RDS VM. And so the way to think about it is not how much of the existing market can you capture, but how big is the next market that the relational databases can't even address? How big is that market going to be? And I think it's probably going to be at least twice the size of the relational market. So right now, Gartner's estimate is a $5 billion NoSQL market, but that's going to be 15 in 5 years.
And so it's really just about painting the picture for why this becomes such an important part of the industry over time.
Yeah, I think it really comes back to the challenges I encountered as an engineer, and I know firsthand this is something that we need to build effective applications, and it's just going to be part of the landscape the way relational databases are part of the landscape.
Yeah, I like that. One other thing that I think about with just generally in terms of a bit more broader mission oriented, which I think applies to basically every infrastructure software company. And it's actually based on this. So Zuck did some interview series and he was talking about how healthcare didn't really have much tool building. And so, it didn't have some of the efficiency that you get from engineering, where we just focus so much on tool building. And the idea was that tool building just gives you this huge amount of leverage, right? So when you contribute to a company like DataStax or any developer tool company who's enabling a downstream developer to do something else, you're basically freeing up hundreds or millions of hours of effort that the community at large was all going to solve, each sort of independently. And by you doing it upstream and then sort of delivering it to those folks, they get to go do different things. Mm-hmm. And so there's this huge amount of leverage that you get by building a tool company that's going to provide that level of sort of effective and efficiency to all these different projects. And I know, and that, to me, that's really sort of gets me excited about the future of what we're able to do and the velocity at which we're able to keep moving. And I think it provides me with some really crystal clear value for what we're doing day in, day out.
No, that's a good point. If you look at 2001 up through roughly 2009 or so, the industry state of the art for solving the scale out data problem was to shard a relational database. And, this was an ad hoc solution that different companies approached differently. And it tended to not be very reusable from one project to another, even within a company.
Right.
So having a general purpose solution that just makes that something you don't have to think about very hard, I think that is super valuable. And then the question is, so if I'm going to apply this to starting a company more generally, how big is the problem that I'm solving for people?
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't seem like we have any lack of data and systems problems. There's a lot here, so I'm enthusiastic about the future of what you're building. And Jonathan, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate all the insights into building such an interesting infrastructure company. So thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Grant. I appreciate it.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just to learn more about enterprise features, find us at EnterpriseReady.io. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com to check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders. This podcast is also brought to you by my company, Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications to their largest enterprise customers. Check us out at replicated.com.